Hello, Lana the Educator here, bringing you your lesson 2 in our ELA segment. Today we'll be looking at the topic of voice, particularly distinguishing between active and passive voice. Now, in ELA, voice can refer to two different concepts, active and passive verb voice, which we're going to look at today. And this describes whether the subject performs the action. And there is also the author's or the narrator's voice, which refers to the unique style or personality and perspective of the writer in a literary work. Verb voice is a grammatical structure, which is what we're going to look at today, the active voice versus the passive voice, while literary voice is about an author's distinct style, tone, and attitude. So as I said, we will be looking at verb voice, which is a term that is used to denote the form of the verb, which shows if the subject in a given sentence is the doer or the receiver of the action. So the objectives for today's lesson are to differentiate between active and passive voice, to identify examples of each sentence type, and to apply new understanding by transforming sentences from one voice to another. So what is it? What is active voice and what is passive voice? And really, they are just different ways of constructing sentences. Active voice is where the subject of the sentence performs the action. Passive voice is where the subject of the sentence receives the action. One thing we should note is that passive voice is not grammatically incorrect. It is just that active voice makes your writing a lot clearer. Let's look at this example of active voice. Haley wrote the essay. Haley is the one performing the action here, right? So in the sentence, Haley, as we are seeing here, is the subject. Just going to check because Haley is the one performing the action. Wrote is the verb, that is the doing thing. And the essay is the object of the sentence. So the subject, Haley, is the one performing the action. And that's simple, the way that we look at active voice. Let's look at this example now. Elijah kicked the ball. This is in the active voice, right? You have your subject, Elijah here, being the one doing the action, which is kicking, and the ball is the thing receiving the action, which is the object of the sentence. Now, if you were to turn this sentence into the passive voice, which is what we're going to look at shortly, we will see the ball was kicked by Elijah. So what you really have here is that now the ball, which was previously the receiver of the action, is now the subject of the sentence. So the ball now becomes the focus of the sentence, and it was kicked by Elijah. So now you have the subject of the sentence receiving the action. So what are the rules of the active and passive voice? So the main rule that we want to look at is that the subject of the sentence performs the action of the verb when we are talking about the active voice, and that helps in creating clear and direct sentences. So let's look at some of the benefits of the active voice. Now, the active voice is really regarded as something that's more dynamic, it's more compelling, because writers often favor it for its directness and seriousness, which make it especially effective in situations where it's important to highlight the subject performing the action. For instance, if we had a business report and we had a sentence, the marketing team launched the new campaign. This sentence clearly states who took the action, and this helps readers to quickly identify the responsible party. This is why this style is also preferred in opinion writing, as it shows confidence and authority. In general, the active voice is the best choice when you want readers to concentrate on the doer of the action rather than the recipient, who is the person receiving the action. So whether you're drafting an email or blog post or writing an essay, the active voice tends to deliver your message more clearly and powerfully, making your ideas and arguments easier to understand and more engaging to read. Let's look at the passive voice. We have an example. The essay was written by Haley. In the active voice, this would be Haley wrote the essay. So Haley in the active voice would have been the subject. Now, in the passive voice, we have the subject, previously being Haley, is now acted upon. So in this sentence, the essay is the subject now, was written is the verb, and that being the auxiliary verb, being the past participle of write, and by Haley indicates the doer of the action. The subject, the essay in this case, is receiving the action of being written. So what's the rule for the passive voice? The rule of the passive voice indicates that the subject receives the action, which often leads to less direct structure where the doer may be omitted. So why use the passive voice? The passive voice can be used in scientific writing. For example, we might say the rats were placed into the maze. Lab reports often use passive voice to emphasize procedures and results, not necessarily the scientists. Because if we had this in the active voice, we might have said, the scientist placed the rats in the maze. Right? In this case, you want to focus on the procedure and the result rather than what would have been the subject, scientist. Next, we have news and crime reporting, where we can use the passive voice. For example, cash was stolen from the register. You would find that journalists usually use the passive voice to stay neutral and to avoid assigning blame prematurely. If you notice in this sentence, it does not specifically say who stole the cash. Another type of writing in which the passive voice is used is historical or ceremonial writing. This type of writing usually focuses on events rather than the participants. So you would see the treaty was signed in Port of Spain in 1962. The focus was not on the subject or the persons signing the treaty. So in this case, the sentence emphasizes the events without naming the persons involved. And this may be either implied or just unnecessary for the context. So the passive voice really works best when the action itself is more important than the actor or the person performing the action, or when the actor is unknown or simply irrelevant, or when you are aiming for a neutral or a professional tone. So what's the difference between the active and the passive voice? Well, the primary difference between active voice and passive voice is their tone, the emphasis, and the sentence structure. The active voice presents a more direct and dynamic approach, which clearly identifies who or what is performing an action, while the passive voice is often in a subtler tone, shifting the emphasis away from the doer and onto the action itself or onto the recipient. Why does all of this matter, right? Well, the active voice, as I said, is usually clearer and stronger and more engaging, while the passive voice can sound more formal or be used when we don't know who did the action. So what about changing the active voice to the passive voice? The first thing you want to do in changing the active voice to the passive voice is to find the object, the thing that is being acted upon. Then you want to move that to the front. So let's look at this example. The chef cooked the meal. We may be wanting to change the active voice, which is the sentence above, to the passive voice, which we are seeing below. What we do is find the object. In this case, the thing acted upon is the meal, the verb is cooked, and the subject is the chef. So the object is the meal. We then want to move the meal to the front of the sentence to form the passive voice. So the meal now comes to the front, and then we have to add a form of the verb be. So that might be is, was, were, or are. Those are forms of the helping verb be in the English language. And then you want to have a past tense form of that action verb. Most times, sometimes, well, the past tense form here is cooked. The present tense form would be cook. That would not have worked grammatically if we said the chef cooked the meal. It might be more in the Creole structure. So to make the passive voice, we say the meal, now that we've brought the object to the front, then we add a form of the verb be, in this case was. We add a past tense form, cooked, indicated by the ed, and then we add by, and we add the person who did it, by the chef. So this is how we form the passive voice. Just to recap, the formation of the passive voice, you find the object or the thing that gets acted on, you move it to the front of the sentence, you add a be verb like is, was, were, and are, and you also add the past tense form of that action word, and then you add by plus the person who did the deed. Now, how do you change the passive to the active voice? Well, you want to first find out who did the action. That is the person or thing doing something, right? Then you want to move that to the front of the sentence, and then you want to make sure they're doing the action to something or to someone. So changing the passive to the active voice, you have to find who did the action. So the hurricane ravaged the town. Who did the action here? You need to move that to the front of the sentence, right? To change the passive to the active. So now the hurricane would come to the front of the sentence. And then you want to make sure they are doing the action. In this case, the action is ravage. And what was ravaged? The town. So the subject now becomes the object. Here's a little exercise for you. Can you determine if the sentence is in the active or the passive voice? The sentence is, the orbit to the moon was calculated by a female engineer. Now remember, for it to be in the active voice, the subject must act on something. And for it to be in the passive voice, the subject has to receive the action. Did you determine your answer, active or passive? Good. Let's move on. So the sentence was in the passive voice. To fix it, you needed to rearrange the sentence a bit. A female engineer calculated the orbit to the moon, as opposed to the orbit to the moon was calculated by a female engineer. Good. Let's look at this one. The research findings were carefully analyzed and interpreted by a team of experienced scientists from various fields. Is this in the active or the passive voice? Put your answer in the comments below. The sentence, the research findings were analyzed and interpreted by a team of experienced scientists from various fields, is written in the passive voice. Well, the subject, in this case, the research findings, that is the receiver of the action. The verb phrase here, were, carefully analyzed and interpreted. Those verb phrases are both in the past participle form, and then those verb phrases are preceded by the auxiliary verb were, meaning were came before the verb phrases. This is what signals the passive construction. And then we have the addition of by a team of experienced scientists from various fields. This introduces again that phrase by indicates who performed the action. So to change that into the active voice, a team of experienced scientists from various fields carefully analyzed and interpreted the research findings. Your turn now. Look at the examples below and state which of these are in the passive voice. The examples are: the students' questions are always answered by the teacher. Number 2, they are building a new bridge. And number 3, the homework will be assigned by the teacher tomorrow. Take your time. Which of these are in the passive voice? Let's look at the first example. The students' questions are always answered by the teacher. Let's look for the subject. That's the first thing we need to do. Here, the subject is actually the questions. And in this case, the questions are being answered, that's the verb or the action, by the teacher. We have our construction here, the by. Remember, we must always have by someone else to determine the passive voice. Let's look at 3, which is also passive, right? The homework will be assigned by the teacher tomorrow. Homework is receiving the action of being assigned, be assigned by the agent, the teacher, tomorrow. The active voice, just in case, is number 2. They are building a bridge, right? They, which is the subject, are building, they are doing the action, and the object bridge there. So the 2 passive sentences are 1 and 3. Look at the examples below, and if they are passive, rewrite them to the active voice. So you have to do a bit more work in this case here. We have the pillau was eaten, Maria painted the fence, and the soca song was written by a famous artist. You first have to determine which one is passive or which ones are passive, if that is the case. And then you rewrite them to the active voice. Remember, in the active voice, the subject acts, and in the passive voice, the subject receives the action. The rules for changing the active voice to the passive voice are to find the object, move it to the front, and add a form of the verb be, and then add by. To change the passive voice to the active voice, you have to find out who is doing the action, move that who to the front, and make sure they are doing the action. Write your answers in the comments below. Thanks for watching and happy writing.